Did a global catastrophe destroy Tartaria? And was it frozen and renamed Antarctica? I wasn't looking for Antarctica. I was looking at basement windows. Specifically, I was measuring the depth of window frames set into the stone foundations of a federal customs house in Charleston, South Carolina, built, according to the plaque on its front wall, in 1853. The windows sit roughly 4 feet below the current sidewalk grade. Their glass darkened, their sills thick with a century of accumulated soil and urban fill. The official explanation is subsidence, the gradual settling of streets over time, layers of repaving, storm runoff, the ordinary geology of a coastal city aging in place. I'd heard this explanation before. I'd accepted it before. But standing there with a measuring tape, looking at hand-cut granite lintels buried beneath asphalt that supposedly rose naturally over 170 years, I found myself doing arithmetic that didn't add up. The street would have had to rise at a rate that no geological or civil engineering process in Charleston's documented history could account for. Not gradually, not through any mechanism the city's own infrastructure records describe. The windows weren't sinking. The ground had come up, and something about that distinction, once I noticed it, refused to let me look away. I mention this because it was the beginning of a thread I've now followed across 4 continents, through archives that range from meticulously organized to suspiciously incomplete, and into a question so large I'm still not certain. I've found its edges. The question isn't whether something happened to the world before the historical period we're taught to treat as settled. The question is whether the evidence of what happened is sitting in plain sight, buried not under conspiracy, but under indifference, under the passive agreement of institutions that have decided certain questions aren't worth asking. Let me start with the buildings themselves, because the buildings are where the silence is loudest. There is a category of structure that appears across the globe with a consistency that, once you begin cataloging it, becomes difficult to attribute to coincidence or to the gradual diffusion of architectural fashion. I'm talking about masonry buildings of extraordinary scale and precision, civic buildings, municipal halls, post offices, courthouses, railway terminals, cathedrals, erected in cities that, according to their own founding documents, had existed for less than a generation when the structures appeared. The craftsmanship in these buildings is not merely competent. It is, by any honest engineering assessment, remarkable. Cut stone fitted with tolerances measured in fractions of an inch. Columns turned from single blocks of granite weighing tens of thousands of pounds. Transported, we're told, by horse and wagon over unpaved roads from quarries sometimes hundreds of miles distant. Decorative elements carved with a fluency and intricacy that modern stonemasons, working with diamond-tipped tools and computer-aided design, describe as extraordinarily difficult to replicate. And these buildings appear everywhere, not in the capitals of ancient empires with millennia of accumulated wealth and institutional knowledge, in frontier towns, in settlements that were, by their own official histories, wilderness 30 years before the buildings materialized. San Francisco, Melbourne, Buenos Aires, Kolkata, St. Petersburg, cities on different continents, in different empires, under different governments, all producing the same architectural language at the same historical moment, all doing so with construction documentation that is either sparse, contradictory, or entirely absent. The pattern repeats with a precision that I find impossible to dismiss as stylistic imitation. Ask yourself a practical question. You are the mayor of a town of 9,000 people on the American frontier in 1858. You have dirt roads. You have a single rail line. Your economy runs on agriculture and a modest shipping trade. According to the standard narrative, you commission and construct a 4-story granite courthouse with a copper dome, marble interior columns, arched windows with hand-forged iron, frames, and a foundation sunk 12 feet into bedrock. You do this with local labor, in a town that lacks a single architecture school, a single quarry capable of producing dressed stone at that volume, a single crane capable of lifting the capstones into position. You accomplish this in under 3 years. And the records that should document this extraordinary feat, the contracts, the payrolls, the engineering drawings, the shipping manifests for thousands of tons of stone, are either missing or were never created. I've searched. In archive after archive, the construction documentation for these buildings is the thinnest file in the drawer. Not because it was destroyed, because it appears never to have existed in the quantity that a project of that magnitude would require. We have the buildings. We have the dedication plaques. What we frequently don't have is the paper trail connecting the two. This is where the buried floors become impossible to ignore. Across dozens of these structures, a pattern emerges that I initially assumed was unique to Charleston, but which I've now documented in cities as far apart as Portland, Oregon, and Omsk, Russia. The ground floor, the street-level entrance that the building's architects clearly designed as the primary point of entry, sits partially or entirely below the current ground surface. Windows that were designed to admit light at eye level now peer out from below sidewalks. Doorways that opened onto what was once street grade now lead into what appear to be basements. The stairs that descend to these buried floors are original to the structure. The stonework is continuous. The walls don't show the kind of later modification you'd expect if a basement had been retrofitted after construction. These floors were built as ground floors. They became buried floors afterward. Something covered them. The standard explanation varies by city: street regrading, flood mitigation, fire response. In cities like Seattle and Portland, the narrative is that streets were deliberately raised after fires destroyed the original wooden infrastructure, burying the stone ground floors of buildings that survived. And in some cases, that's verifiable. Seattle did raise its streets. Portland did fill in low-lying areas. But the explanation doesn't scale. It doesn't account for the same phenomenon appearing in cities that experienced no documented fire, no recorded regrading, no institutional decision to bury an entire commercial district under 6 to 10 feet of fill material. It doesn't account for the global distribution. It doesn't account for the uniformity. And it doesn't answer the question that sits underneath all the practical explanations. What deposited the material? In cities where regrading is documented, the fill is identifiable: rubble, gravel, engineered substrate. But in cities where no regrading is documented, the material burying these floors is often a dense, mineral-rich clay or sediment that geologists I've spoken with describe as consistent with flood deposition, or more cautiously, with rapid particulate settlement from an atmospheric event. Not volcanic ash exactly, something finer, something more uniformly distributed, something that settled across thousands of miles with a consistency that a single localized event cannot explain. I need to talk about 1816 now, because 1816 is the hinge, the year without a summer, the year the sky went wrong. Officially attributed to the eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia in April 1815, the largest volcanic eruption in recorded human history, a detonation that ejected an estimated 160 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere and, we're told, lowered global temperatures by an average of 0.5 degrees Celsius for the following year. The effects were real. Snow fell in New England in June. Crops failed across Europe. Livestock died. Famine spread through communities that had been prosperous months before. The sunsets turned red, then orange, then a deep, bruised violet that painters of the era captured on canvas with a kind of bewildered reverence. And I accepted this explanation for a long time. A single catastrophic eruption, a veil of ash, a year of darkness. Tidy, documented, scientifically respectable. But the deeper I looked, the less the single volcano theory accounted for the scope of what happened. The atmospheric disruption didn't behave the way volcanic ash typically behaves. It was too uniform, too global, too prolonged. Volcanic eruptions, even enormous ones, produce asymmetric atmospheric effects, concentrated in one hemisphere, tapering over months, dissipating as particulate matter falls back to Earth. The 1816 event was symmetric. It affected both hemispheres simultaneously. It lasted not months, but years, with abnormal weather patterns persisting in some regions through 1819. The signature, when you examine it without the predetermined assumption of a single volcanic source, looks less like a natural eruption and more like something engineered, or at minimum, something compounded, something that involved forces we haven't accounted for. And the social effects were stranger still. The years immediately following 1816 don't just show climate disruption. They show discontinuity, communities that appear to lose contact with their own recent past, orphan populations surging in cities across Europe and North America, not gradually, not as part of a demographic trend, but suddenly, in numbers that overwhelm the institutional capacity to manage them. Cities that appear in the historical record as if from nowhere, their infrastructure already in place, their populations arriving to occupy structures that someone apparently had already built, construction dates that don't survive scrutiny, founding myths that substitute for founding documentation, an entire generation that seems to inherit a world it didn't construct and can't fully explain. I want to pause here and introduce something I've been reluctant to discuss, not because the evidence is weak, but because the language around it has been so badly degraded by sensationalism that the serious inquiry gets buried beneath the noise. Tartaria. The word itself has become almost unusable in academic settings, which is itself a kind of evidence. Because Tartaria is not a modern invention. It appears on maps, hundreds of them, published by the most respected cartographers in European history, from the 16th through the early 19th century, depicting a vast territory spanning northern and central Asia, not a legend, not a mythological kingdom sketched in the margins of a speculative atlas, a labeled, bordered, geographically specific region that appeared in encyclopedias and reference works with the same casual authority as Persia or the Ottoman Empire. And then, sometime in the mid-19th century, it vanished. Not conquered, not renamed in any documented treaty, erased. The maps were redrawn, the encyclopedias were revised. The territory that had occupied more landmass than Europe simply ceased to appear, as if a collective editorial decision had been made to pretend it had never been there. The architectural evidence I described earlier, the uniform grandeur, the impossible timelines, the missing construction records, the buildings that appear fully formed in places too young and too small to have produced them, clusters geographically and chronologically in ways that align with the former territory of Tartaria and with the period of its disappearance from the cartographic record. This is not proof of anything. It is a correlation, but it is a correlation that, the longer I sit with it, the heavier it becomes. Now hold that thought, because I need to take you somewhere cold. Antarctica appears on maps before it was officially discovered. This is not speculation. This is cartographic fact. The Piri Reis map, dated 1513, compiled by an Ottoman admiral who explicitly noted that he was working from older source charts, depicts a southern landmass with a coastline that, when overlaid against modern imaging of the subglacial terrain beneath the Antarctic ice sheet, aligns with a precision that has generated serious, peer-reviewed academic debate. The Oronteus Phineas map of 1531 goes further. It shows an ice-free Antarctica with river systems and mountain ranges that were not technologically confirmed until mid-20th century sonar surveys. The conventional explanation is that these cartographers were guessing, extrapolating from philosophical assumptions about hemispheric symmetry, drawing what they believed should exist, rather than what they knew existed. And perhaps that's true. But I struggle with the specificity of the guess. You can guess that a southern landmass exists. You cannot guess the precise contour of its coastline. You cannot guess the location of rivers that are currently buried under 2 miles of ice. You cannot guess subglacial mountain ridges with the kind of accuracy that survives comparison to satellite data 5 centuries later. That is not guessing. That is mapping from knowledge. Knowledge that someone possessed, that someone transmitted, that someone preserved across centuries and through whatever happened in between. And then, in 1820, 4 years after the sky went dark, 3 expeditions from 3 different nations arrive at this supposedly undiscovered continent within months of each other. A British crew, a Russian crew, an American crew, all operating independently, we're told, all converging on the same remote, ice-locked landmass at the same historical moment. This is presented in every textbook as a coincidence of competitive exploration, and perhaps it is. But the timing sits in my mind like a stone I can't swallow. 4 years after a catastrophic atmospheric event that may have accelerated polar glaciation. 4 years after whatever happened to the civilization whose architectural fingerprints we keep finding in cities we didn't build. 4 years, and suddenly, the world's most inaccessible landmass enters the official record, as if on cue. Let me trace the thread forward, because it doesn't end in 1820. In 1938, Nazi Germany dispatched a major expedition to Antarctica, the Schwabenland expedition. They mapped nearly 600,000 square kilometers, dropped territorial markers, photographed the landscape from aircraft, and returned with materials that reportedly shifted internal priorities within the regime's scientific apparatus. The specific nature of those materials has never been fully disclosed. The records are incomplete in the particular way that records tend to be incomplete when the contents matter. In 1946, 1 year after the war ended, the United States Navy launched Operation High Jump, not a research team, a military operation. 13 ships, 33 aircraft, nearly 5,000 personnel, led by Rear Admiral Richard Byrd, a man whose previous polar expeditions had already established him as one of the most experienced Antarctic explorers alive. The stated objective was routine: mapping, research, training exercises in cold weather operations. The operation was planned for 6 to 8 months. It ended after approximately 8 weeks. Byrd returned to Washington. His public comments afterward were measured but strange. In a widely reported interview, he referenced potential threats from aircraft that could fly from pole to pole at tremendous speed. The context was unclear. The remark was not pursued by the journalists present. The conversation moved on. And then, in 1959, at the height of the Cold War, an era when the United States and the Soviet Union could not agree on the color of the sky, 50 nations signed the Antarctic Treaty, a document that designates Antarctica as a scientific preserve, prohibits military activity, forbids mineral extraction, bans nuclear testing, and establishes a framework of international cooperation that has no parallel anywhere else in geopolitics. 50 nations, in 1959, agreeing on anything, about a continent that officially contains nothing of strategic or economic interest, nothing but ice and research stations and penguins. I want to sit with the coordination problem for a moment, because it is, in my view, the most intellectually honest place to pause. Nations do not agree. That is the fundamental operating principle of international relations. The 20th century was shaped by disagreement. Wars, proxy conflicts, economic rivalries, ideological confrontations that consumed millions of lives. And yet, on this one question, about this one continent, the entire international community achieved and has maintained, for over 6 decades, a level of unanimous cooperation that exists nowhere else on Earth. No territorial disputes, no resource competition, no unilateral military action, nothing. 65 years of perfect agreement about a frozen landmass that, by the official account, offers nothing worth disagreeing about. What requires that level of consensus? What could possibly sit beneath 2 miles of ice that would compel every major power on Earth to collectively agree to leave it alone? I don't have an answer. I want to be honest about that. What I have is a pattern, a sequence of dates, a geography of silence, an accumulation of architectural anomalies and cartographic impossibilities and institutional behaviors that, taken individually, can each be explained away, but taken together begin to describe a shape, the shape of something removed, something covered, something frozen, perhaps literally in place. Consider the sequence one more time. A global civilization whose infrastructure appears across continents, without adequate construction documentation. An atmospheric catastrophe in 1816 whose scope exceeds the explanatory power of a single volcanic eruption. A sudden surge of orphaned populations and cities without origins in the years that follow. A continent that appears on maps centuries before its official discovery. Depicted without ice, with geographical features confirmed only by 20th century technology. That continent officially entered into the record 4 years after the catastrophe, by 3 nations simultaneously. A military buildup around the continent in the 1940s involving both Axis and Allied powers. And then a treaty, unprecedented, universal, enduring, sealing the continent from independent exploration precisely when the technology to penetrate its ice sheet first becomes available. Each element, in isolation, has a conventional explanation. Volcanic eruptions happen. Maps contain errors. Treaties get signed. Basements get buried. I understand that. I've read the conventional explanations. I've weighed them carefully. And what I keep finding is that they explain each element, but not the pattern. They account for the pieces, but not for their arrangement. They answer every individual question while avoiding the question that connects them all. There is one more thread I need to pull before I close, because it connects the architecture to the ice in a way I didn't expect when I started this research. The ornamental features of the buildings I've been studying, the domes, the spires, the elaborate metalwork crowning their roof lines, have always been classified as decorative, aesthetic choices, the architectural vocabulary of an era that valued grandeur for its own sake. But I've been corresponding with electrical engineers and materials scientists who've examined the metallurgical composition and geometric configuration of these elements. And what they describe is not decoration. The copper domes are shaped as Faraday cages. The iron spires are grounded to bedrock through continuous metal pathways embedded in the masonry. The ornamental metalwork on the roof lines, the finials, the cresting, the acroteria, are configured in patterns that, in modern electrical engineering, would be recognized as antenna arrays, not identical to modern designs, but operating on the same physical principles. The buildings, whatever else they were, appear to have been designed to interact with atmospheric energy in ways that our current architectural paradigm doesn't account for, and our current academic framework doesn't acknowledge. If that's true, and I present it as a question, not a conclusion, then the buildings weren't just offices. They were infrastructure, part of a system that was interrupted, possibly by the same catastrophic event that changed the atmosphere, that deposited the sediment, that froze the continent that the maps said was once green. And here is what I find most unsettling about that possibility. If the buildings were functional infrastructure, nodes in some kind of atmospheric or electromagnetic network, then their ornamental features weren't ornamental at all. They were components, and the civilization that built them wasn't decorating its government offices with copper and iron for the sake of beauty. It was engineering something that operated at a scale we haven't considered, because we've been taught to look at these structures through the lens of aesthetics, rather than the lens of physics. Once you shift that lens, the buildings stop looking like monuments and start looking like machines. Dormant machines. Machines whose power source was interrupted and whose operators vanished in the same compressed historical window that swallowed Tartaria from the maps and sealed Antarctica under ice. I spent 3 weeks in the municipal archives of St. Petersburg last year, searching for construction documentation on the administrative buildings along the Neva embankment. These are massive structures, granite and marble, columns that would require modern industrial cranes to position. The official records credit their construction to various imperial architects working under Catherine the Great and her successors, but the documentation I found was almost entirely dedicatory. Ceremony records, inauguration dates, the names of officials who presided over ribbon cuttings. What I could not find, in 3 weeks of searching, were engineering drawings at the scale you would need to erect a building of that complexity. No detailed foundation specifications, no crane deployment plans, no quarry shipping manifests for the thousands of tons of dressed stone these buildings contain. The archivist I worked with, a careful woman who had spent 30 years in that institution, told me something I haven't been able to forget. She said, "The buildings are here. The paper is not." I stopped asking why a long time ago. That sentence has stayed with me ever since, because it describes exactly the posture that the institutional world has adopted toward this entire question. The buildings are here. The paper is not. Stop asking. But the buildings are talking, even if the archives are silent. The proportions speak. The engineering speaks. The buried floors speak. The metallurgical composition of the roofline elements speaks. And when you gather all of that testimony together, it tells a story that the official record has not just failed to tell, but has actively, if passively, suppressed. Not through censorship, through disinterest, through the quiet, devastating refusal to connect the evidence that is already sitting in plain view. I keep returning to the basement windows, those hand-cut granite lintels sitting 4 feet below a sidewalk that shouldn't be there. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. The stone is fitted with a precision that speaks of knowledge and care and capability, and it's buried, not destroyed, not dismantled, not erased in the way that fire or war erases things, just covered, quietly, incrementally, layer by layer until the ground floor became a basement and everyone forgot it had ever been anything else. Maybe that's the mechanism. Not destruction, but displacement. Not erasure, but burial. Not a lie exactly, but a silence so complete and so prolonged that it functions as one. We walk over the evidence every day. We work inside it. We file our taxes in buildings whose proportions don't match the people filing them. We accept dates that don't survive arithmetic. We look at maps that show things we're told nobody knew, and we call it coincidence. We look at a continent sealed by international treaty, and we don't ask what's underneath. The buildings remember. The maps preserve what the textbooks omit. The timeline holds its shape if you're willing to follow it without flinching. And Antarctica sits at the bottom of the world, silent, frozen, guarded by the only unanimous agreement in modern geopolitical history, holding whatever it holds beneath 2 miles of ice that may have formed not over millennia, as we're taught, but over years, over months, over the span of a single catastrophic event whose aftershocks we are still, all of us right now, living inside. I don't know what's under the ice. I know that someone did once. I know that the maps they drew survived. I know that the buildings they built still stand, half-buried, mislabeled, stripped of their origin stories and dressed in histories that don't fit. I know that the timeline holds if you let it. And I know that the silence, the careful, institutional, cross-continental silence that descends every time these questions approach the surface, that silence is not the absence of an answer. It is the outline of one. If this series is worth something to you, consider subscribing. The next episode goes deeper into the architectural evidence, into the specific construction anomalies that I believe connect the pre-catastrophe infrastructure to the cartographic record. I wasn't sure I was ready to go there. I think I am now. I'll see you there.